Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to ICLR's Friday Forum. Today, we have the privilege of having Dr. Kevin Quigley with us, who's going to talk about how media reports on disaster events. So just a brief introduction on Professor Quigley. So he is a professor of public administration at Dalhousie University, who specializes in risk governance and critical infrastructure, with a particular focus on public sector responses to rare and high impact events such as pandemics, natural disasters, industrial failures, and cyber and terrorist attacks. He's published 2 critically acclaimed books on critical infrastructure, including his most recent, Too Critical to Fail: How Canada Manages Threats to Critical Infrastructure. Without further ado, I'll let Dr. Quigley present, and I would just like to make a quick reminder that we'll go through the questions at the question period at the very end of the webinar, but please free to write your questions in the question box during Professor Quigley's presentation, and I'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So thank you very much, Kevin, for being here, and welcome everyone.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Sophie. Thanks to ICLR, and also thanks to Paul Kovacs for the invitation to talk today about some of the research I've been doing around media coverage about disasters. Thanks also for attending our talk this afternoon, on Friday afternoon. I'm a little surprised that people would be interested in talking about these things on a Friday afternoon, but there you go. Maybe I'll try and set you up for the weekend, and this will stimulate your thinking on the weekend. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about how the media cover crises and disasters, and I'll get to what I mean by that in a sec, but I want to just sort of signal the framework that I often use to understand these problems. So I'm very interested in social context and how context influences the way governments are particularly interested in risk regulation. I often use Hood, Rossi, and Baldwin's risk regulation regimes framework, and Hood, Rossi, and Baldwin essentially created a framework where they look at context, they think about how context influences content, and they looked at a variety of different policy areas, and they showed there was quite a bit of variation in the way that governments respond to risks. So there's not really one particularly standard way of responding to risks. There's no sort of rational cost-benefit analysis that can be dictated across a number of policy areas. There's actually quite a bit of variation. So they tested 3 hypotheses to try to explain why this variation exists. So first off, let's just say in terms of the regime itself, when Hood, Rossi, and Baldwin talk about risk regulation regimes, they use cybernetics, understanding of cybernetics, to define control. And by cybernetic control, we're talking about information gathering, standard setting, and behavior modification, which is to say your system needs a capacity to gather information, set standards, and change behavior in order for a system to be under control. So in governments, we frequently think about standards, which are rules, regulations, directives, policies. We also think a lot about information gathering. Governments do a lot of information gathering before they set standards. We think a little less about behavior modification, even though actually it's a crucial component to understanding control. How do we actually modify people's behavior, either through penalties, incentives, culture change, education, training, etc. So how do we actually get people to change their behavior in light of a certain risk? So again, 3 components to controlling a risk: information gathering, standard setting, behavior modification. If you can't control those 3 things, then your system is not under control. An example I usually use with my class is when you think about the speed limit at a speed limit on the road. If it's like 40 kilometers an hour, but if you have no capacity to understand what speed cars are going at, and you have no capacity to compel people to go at 40 kilometers an hour if they're going at 60 or 70 or 100 or even 10 kilometers an hour, then you can say the speed limit is 40 kilometers an hour, but it's not 40 kilometers an hour at all, right? You're not really controlling the system. So that's the regimes part, but Hood, Rossi, and Baldwin also look at different contextual factors that influence the way governments respond, and some policy areas are more sensitive to different kinds of pressures. So they look at the pressure that markets and market dynamics and market failures have on government. So to what extent would a market failure explain government response? A second hypothesis would be the opinion responsive hypothesis, which considers media and public opinion. So they put those two in the same category and ask themselves to what extent does public opinion influence the way government responds to risk, and to what extent does media coverage. And when they say media coverage, they're really looking at kind of broadsheet, uh, high quality broadsheet media coverage that leaders in civil society would be likely to engage in. So you could think about it in terms of just sort of mass social media campaigns, but in this particular context, we're really talking about quality broadsheets that would influence civil society thinking and the leaders of civil society. And the third hypothesis is interest groups. To what extent does the concentration of power and authority influence the way governments respond to risk? I'll note as an aside, we're doing lots of work on COVID-19 right now, and I'm using this framework as well as some others to understand that. So to what extent do these factors influence the way the government responds to COVID-19? I'll just also mention that in Hood, Rossi, and Baldwin's work, they found interest groups usually came out as the most influential pressure in terms of how government responded. Rarely market failures, and very rarely media and public opinion. But today I do want to talk a little bit about the way media, this one particular hypothesis, so I'm going to leave interests and markets behind. I want to talk a little bit about media and public opinion and the extent to which they influence government responses, and how we might think about that in terms of climate issues. So we have a database at the McEachern Institute, or I as a researcher have a database, and I look at a number of different events, and I have categorized them as natural disaster. I'm going to just run through a list of some things that are included in this database just to give you a sort of sense of the disasters that we've looked at. Under natural disaster, we have a long list of natural disasters. We have a long list of industrial failures, which are like train wrecks, bridge collapses, things like that, propane, chemical explosions, issues of that nature, terrorist attacks, terrorist plots. Terrorist plots are different from terrorist attacks because terrorist plots were foiled. They didn't actually occur. Terrorist attacks actually occurred. Cyber events, pandemics. With the pandemic, we did a lot of work around media coverage of H1N1 in the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia. I will say that in the database, we looked at, for Canadian cases, we looked at the Globe and Mail. We looked at media coverage for 365 days, starting on day one when the event started, and we ran it out for 365 days. When we were looking at an American event, we looked at the New York Times. When we were looking at a British event, we were looking at the Daily Telegraph. And we were looking at Australia events, we were looking at the Australian. So essentially the sort of leading broadsheets from the four countries, or a leading broadsheet from the four countries. I realize this doesn't take into account the sort of ideological underpinnings of these newspapers. I think that's fair to say, but we were just trying to get a flavor of a leading broadsheet, what its coverage was like. When we look at the events, we look at the number of articles, we look at the tone of the articles, is the tone of the headline, and we also look at the manner, and this is what I particularly want to talk about today, is volume of coverage, and also the manner in which the government is assessed, the tone of the coverage. So by that I mean, when you read an article, is your overall impression favorable of the government, or negative in terms of the government's performance, or neutral? And neutral can come about because there's an equal amount of positive comments as negative comments. Neutral can also come about because there doesn't seem to be an implied judgment about the government's performance. So that's what I want to talk a little bit about today, some of the work on the volume of coverage and the performance assessment, which was qualitative in nature and fairly resource intensive. It really required someone to go through each of the articles and make an assessment of how the government was assessed. So normally if you took one particular event, like say Lac Concord bridge collapse, we would have one person who would do an analysis of that one event from top to bottom in the Globe and Mail. And then we did a number of sort of validity testing where we shared articles to make sure there was a high level of agreement between those who are evaluating the articles, to make sure there was some consistency. Not a perfect method and very labor intensive, as I say, but it did generate some interesting observations that I'd like to share with you. So as I say, I want to talk a little bit about the volume of media coverage and the performance assessment. This line, the vertical line in this graph shows the volume of media coverage, which is to say the number of articles that appeared over that 365-day period over about a particular event. And then we created this horizontal axis that showed the performance assessment of the particular events. So by that, we want to see if the articles were positive or negative in their assessment of the government. So if your story is on the right-hand side, it means that the government was assessed positively in the media coverage, and that's why we've given it this nice green color. And if your story is on the left-hand side, then the media coverage was negative about the role of government. And obviously, if it goes up or down, it shows something about the volume of coverage. So when we grouped the types of stories together, what we found was that there were patterns in the media coverage. First off, natural disasters receive high volume media coverage, and they can generate positive assessments of government. And you can see why this is, because during a crisis itself, during the natural disaster, um, a lot of emergency services have a lot of work to do, and their media is generally cooperative with them in conveying their message, but also just generally recognizing that emergency services is doing the best they can in bad circumstances. So they tend to give positive coverage, but most of the coverage, as it is with most of these events, happens within 30 days of the event. It's about 60, 70, I think it's 70%. 70% of the articles are published within 30 days of the event. Sometimes there is a little bit of a blip 3, 4, 5 months later, maybe 6 months later, if there's some sort of audit of the event. So you might get another little bump. But about 70% of the articles happen or occur during the event itself. So natural disasters, as I say, high volume coverage and positive assessments of government. Terrorist attacks, a bit more neutral. There's a little bit of sympathy for government in the performance, but it can tip a little bit to the negative because after all, the terrorist attack occurred, and usually there's some sort of criticism around a lack of coordination, that the government didn't see it coming or didn't respond more effectively or more efficiently, which is quite different from a failed terrorist plot. In the failed terrorist plots, it got a lot less coverage, but it was largely positive because the government, of course, the police, emergency services were able to foil the plot. Industrial failures receive almost entirely negative media coverage. There is a ruthless hunt for accountability. The expression that some people use is, if you build it, you better maintain it. So if you're talking about bridge collapses, you're talking about um, um, train wrecks, chemical explosions, usually take the media about 48 hours to figure out, when were the last audits, who's responsible, to get in touch with academics to talk about where the critical vulnerabilities were. There's usually the first bit of the coverage is usually about the devastation itself and the victims. But in about 48 hours, it starts to shift, if even less than 48 hours, to start asking questions about who's accountable, who's responsible. So unlike natural disasters, that really, generally speaking, there's kind of an absence of questioning about who's responsible for this. And you could, quite rightly wonder, if you build a community in a flood-prone zone and the properties flood, then you could ask tougher questions about maybe questions about accountability. But as I say, the coverage tends to be positive in terms of emergency services. Might be changing a little bit now, but those are the patterns that we saw in the events that we looked at. With industrial failures, it's a much more narrow and focused kind of coverage that looks at that really is looking for an individual to hold to account, or individuals. And what you would tend to find in this coverage is it neglects the overall broader decision-making processes, organizational context, organizational culture. It can be quite narrow and ruthless in its hunt for accountability. Lac-Mégantic gave us quite a bit on this story, actually. If you think about Lac-Mégantic, fairly ruthless hunt for accountability among the train engineers. There were some questions about Transport Canada and its role, and various private interests that were maybe taking some unnecessary risks in transporting dangerous chemicals. But it really all sort of fell away, and there was much more narrow focus on the role of the engineers and the role they played, and that led to the tragedy in Lac-Mégantic. A couple more points I'll make here. Cyber attacks really don't get a lot of coverage. They might be getting a little bit more now, and they tend to do better when there's some sort of celebrity involved. So if there's a famous person, so you think about sort of Donald Trump talking about the Russians, Snowden, for example. If there's some sort of celebrity, there's a personality can drive a story, so you get a lot more coverage. But generally speaking, cyber attacks are a little bit boring. They're technically sophisticated. The Society of Actuaries a couple of years ago talked about the cyber attacks and interconnected infrastructures among the most severe risks that our society faces and the ones about which we are most concerned. But it really has a hard time getting media coverage. I think the other reason perhaps why it's neglected a little bit is one, as I say, it's hard to make it into an interesting story. There's only so many stories you can have of somebody's hands on a keyboard tapping away, and it looks like some sort of spy somewhere in Russia or China. So the visual is not there, the personalities aren't there. We don't really know who's responsible. And the other thing, of course, too, is people like a lot of flexibility in their technology. So there continues to be resistance and reluctance for governments to overly regulate some of these technologies. People prefer to have some flexibility. So if it leads to heavy-handed regulation, it may be unpopular. So for a whole bunch of reasons, we see cyber attacks. Again, it's a bit maybe like climate change. We're seeing some increased coverage, but I would say it helps a lot if you've got a personality attached to the story. The other one I'll just point out is the top left-hand corner there. It's totally off the graph, which is pandemics. When we did our H1N1 coverage, I mean, there was so much media coverage of H1N1 over the 365-day period. Essentially, that story started in the spring of 2009, I guess, and that was the first wave, which was very, very small. And then really a lot of media were assigned to the story during the summer. So there never seemed to be a slow period for H1N1, as you saw sort of perpetual interest as the second wave approached. And of course, the second wave hit and it didn't really materialize in the way people thought. But you could see intense interest in the pandemic. And I have to say, when COVID-19 came around, it wasn't really I mean, there's so many things about COVID-19 that are, of course, different from H1N1, and it happened on a different scale. But the kind of susceptibility of the media to really run with this story, I mean, this has been called a media eclipse by one scholar, where there's just simply no oxygen. I mean, you think the first few months of COVID-19, there's virtually no oxygen for any other stories. So we've done some work on that, but it's in some ways you sort of see the seeds of this during H1N1, because there's a huge amount of coverage for H1N1 for something arguably was a bit of a damp squib in terms of the event actually having the kind of impact that people might have anticipated. Okay, so on that note, I want to just shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the climate change issue, because I know there's particular interest in this community among climate issues, and just bring to your attention about some of the work that we have been doing around climate change. And so one of the things we did in our recent research, and I want to kind of come back to natural disasters and climate and how this might tell a story, or might be a forewarning, or it raises a question, I suppose, of whether or not media coverage of climate change will continue to grow, and will it be sufficiently critical, and will it lead to the kind of policy changes we need, or will it actually become less pronounced? And I think there's an interesting question for us to think about here. So we did some media analysis on the term climate change and oil for the last 6 months of 2019 and the first 6 months of 2020. And the reason we picked that, and we picked that for a number of terms in our media search, and the reason we did that was because, of course, there was an election in 2019. And so what we wanted to see was, to what extent did media coverage change between the last 6 months of 2019 and the first 6 months of 2020 when the pandemic hit. And so what you see is climate change in 2019, particularly in October, had a very high number of hits, 1,774 hits. And I'll say in this case, there were 3 different media sources we were using: CBC, National Post, and the Toronto Star. So those 3 together, there were 1,774 mentions of climate change in the last 6 months of 2019. The first 6 months of 2020, it dropped off to 817. Oil was consistent throughout. There really wasn't any serious change in the first 6 months and the last 6 months. And so I kind of wondered a little bit about some of Anthony Downs' work, which I'll get to in a second, but I'm going to flag this other issue before I get to it. And it's the issue of Canadians' priorities in the last election, our 2021. So I will cite this as a poll from the National Post. And so there may be a whole bunch of reasons to believe that National Post has a particular bias that might generate certain kinds of results. But I do think that in the last federal election anyway, climate change didn't necessarily get, it certainly got some profile among the leaders, but when you ask Canadians, is it a priority for you, or what was the priority, what you saw was cost of living, increased healthcare funding, post-pandemic economic recovery, managing the pandemic, the level of taxes Canadians pay, housing affordability. Climate change came 7th in the particular poll that I'm citing here, and then reducing poverty, number 8. So all this to sort of just say, as we come out of the pandemic, knowing some of the patterns of media coverage, so historically we have patterns of media coverage where it's been positive, not particularly ruthless, let's say, in the same way that industrial failures are, which perhaps, I guess, limits the sort of rigor of questioning that really should be coming to government officials about what are you doing to address climate issues. The fact during natural disasters, the coverage has been sort of positive about government performance. And then between events, of course, there's not really a lot of coverage. So does that media coverage really lead us to the kind of scrutiny and interrogation of climate policies that is really required to bring about change? And then we see during the pandemic, climate fell away in references in popular media. And then as we approach the 2021 federal election, we see that climate was actually ranked 7th in this particular poll. So I guess the question is it, will cyclical media coverage of climate issues continue? Can it come back with more rigor and more scrutiny in a way that can help bring about meaningful change? So I just signaled to you this piece by Anthony Downs in 1972. It's an oldie but a goldie. And I would also signal to you that Anthony Downs was actually referring to environmental issues when he wrote this piece. He talked about different stages that problems go through: a pre-problem stage, alarm discovery, and euphoric enthusiasm about a particular problem, realizing the cost of significant progress, gradual decline of public interest, and then the post-problem stage when you actually shift attention and look at other problems. So essentially, Downs talks about our very limited focus on certain kinds of problems, that there's this sort of discovery of a problem, and then there's a sort of certain amount of enthusiasm and hunger and appetite to change it. And then once we're confronted with the costs of actually addressing these issues, that once we actually go beyond the headlines and start unpacking it and understanding it for its complexity, we realize actually there are a lot of difficult choices to make. There are a lot of trade-offs that we have to consider, and that people don't necessarily want to engage in those kind of exercises. So then we find another problem. We leave that problem behind, we find another problem. And so Downs says this is part of the issue around the environment, that we struggle with these issues, we struggle with these trade-offs. There's a certain amount of enthusiasm for the problem, then it kind of falls away, then enthusiasm, then it falls away. And that usually goes in some sort of cycle with the economy as well. So when the economy is up, people are more concerned about these issues, and when the economy is down, people are a little less concerned about some of these issues. So you have this sort of cyclical nature. So given that we're in this sort of post-pandemic world, and that it might be that either healthcare or economy becomes people's primary concern, if we look at that federal, just go back for a second to that federal election polling data, does this tell us, does this bode well for media coverage of climate issues in the future? So I did a little bit of a thought experiment on this, and so I thought, well, how could we think about media coverage in the future, and how it might manifest itself in government? And we've been doing a lot of work around scenario planning at the McKechnie Institute because of the particular circumstances in which we find ourselves today. And we use the intuitive logics method here. So the intuitive logic method is largely the Dutch school that refers to Van der Hagen, Van Asselt, and others. That's a process discussion-oriented method. The method helps organizations identify factors that drive the sector and describe plausible futures to which they must react and define policies they can develop in response to these futures. Essentially what you do is you develop plausible, you identify drivers that drive your organization, and then you pick two highly uncertain, highly impactful drivers, and from those two drivers, you paint four plausible futures. As I say, we've been doing a lot of work with this, particularly in the tourism sector. We've been doing a lot of work to help them to understand what the future of tourism looks like right now. But I thought this framework might be a little bit helpful here. So when we think about drivers, the environmental factors that influence or shape the success of our sector, they're often considered outside of your control. They can be social, health, economic, technological, or regulatory factors. And so the way the scenario planning exercise would work is you'd pick this 2x2 matrix, and you'd have driver one would be high or low, and in the the horizontal axis, sorry, I've got driver two in both cases. I mean, driver one on the right-hand side is high, and driver two is high, and driver two is low on the horizontal axis. So you've got two axes scheduled there. And then what you would do is you'd work through these four scenarios, and you'd ask yourself these questions. What does this scenario look like? How did you get to this scenario? What are the underlying causes that led to this? And what are the potential critical failures? What are the opportunities? And then you would name the scenario. So I thought about how media profile might be something to think about, the future of media profile for natural disasters, climate-related disasters. And so you can imagine a future where you have high media profile, where the coverage is, very high volume, or low volume. It becomes less and less of interest to people in the future. And rather than performance assessment, I thought the variable or the driver of accountability, centralized accountability or diffuse accountability, would be useful to think of. So in scenario one, you would have high media profile and centralized accountability, which is to say that the accountability is it's acute in terms of who is responsible for certain functions that might relate to emergency response during a climate event, or just climate policy more generally. Scenario two is an example where there's low media profile and it is also centralized accountability. Scenario three, low media profile and diffuse accountability, where it's not so central, which is a little bit more of I think the situation we're in now. And scenario four, where you have high media profile and diffuse accountability. So I tried to imagine what this might look like, or what would government responses look like to these four scenarios. And I imagine these four ways of thinking about it. So if you had high media profile and centralized accountability, it would probably manifest in some sort of climate czar approach to governance. It would be top down, it would be high profile, you'd have some sort of prominent figure leading it. It would be very process oriented, bureaucratic to a certain extent. Command and control, organized, segmented, the way any bureaucracy would be, but you would obviously have some sort of strong sense of leadership. The focus would be on the leadership. If it were centralized accountability and low media profile, I describe this as the busy bureaucrat. So this is an example where climate policy does not get the profile that you might hope. And it's sort of buried within the bureaucracy. And so you have bureaucrats working away, but they're not really getting the attention that you might hope. So in some ways, they don't have the negative aspects of attention, but they have the risks of budget cuts, I would suspect, if they don't get the attention that might sustain the politicians' attention. The bottom left-hand corner, lonely activists and blame gamers. This is where media coverage is low for climate disasters or climate policy, and it's diffuse accountability, which again means decentralized accountability. So again, lonely activists and blame gamers means that you basically don't get a lot of media coverage for climate policy, and accountability is spread out all over the place. And so as a result of that, what you have are activists who are driving it as best they can, and bureaucrats avoiding responsibility as best as they can because nobody wants to own it because they're not likely to get the budget they require in order to pursue various climate policies. Top left-hand corner is when there's high media coverage, but the accountability is still diffuse. I call this Go Team because it has to be some sort of coordinated response among a number of public entities. I think that's the case because, and that's probably actually close to where we are now because a lot of climate policy is highly dispersed across a number of orders of government. And so it leaves a lot of room still for blame shifting. But when there's actually high media coverage, you don't necessarily get so much blame shifting. You get a lot of sort of positive enthusiasm about we need to work together to address this problem. So when the media coverage is up, there's Go Team. But when the media coverage is down, it's really being driven by activists and blame gamers who are trying to shift responsibilities to others. So I have not done it per se. I sort of invite you to use these tools if you wanted to think through how this might manifest. But one will work through these 4 scenarios and ask yourself these kinds of questions of what does the scenario look like? How did you get to this scenario? What are the underlying causes that led to this? And what are the potential critical failures? And what are the opportunities? And then you would name the scenario as I have. A second way to use this that I just thought I would point out is that in fact, in some respects, this graph, you could say that media coverage and climate policy uh, goes into different boxes at different times. So, for example, I mean, if media coverage is driven by a crisis, then it's more likely that you're going to be in high media profile when there's a crisis, and when there's no crisis, you're much more likely to be below the line in the bottom half of the graph. So essentially, what you'd have, if you think about where we're at now, it might be that we're more in the bottom left-hand corner where it's being driven by activists and bureaucrats who are doing a little gaming so they don't own too much responsibility. And then when there is a crisis, it moves up into Go Team, where you see these calls for coordination in government agencies that are congratulating themselves for working so effectively together. It may very well be that what you want and what we're hoping a lot of the initiatives that are occurring around climate is to try to move this to the right, where it's more deeply embedded in the institutional arrangements and there's strong leadership, strong ownership, stronger sense of accountability, and you want to try to move it either into climate czar, but there is the risk of it dropping to busy bureaucrat if it doesn't get the kind of media profile that that it deserves. I think that one of the things that can help you to do in using or thinking these sort of 4 scenarios is that opportunities then can present themselves. So when there is a crisis, there's an opportunity to bring about some change, but you need to sort of be ready at the go to argue for that change when that crisis occurs. So I'm going to make just some concluding observations and based on these comments. So what we found in our database is that although these crises seem like very they're unique. Whenever you talk to somebody, when you ever do interviews with people who work in organizations that live through these kind of crises, they always tell you how it was incredible and dramatic, and it's never been like this before, and it'll never be like this again, et cetera, et cetera. And then when you study them more systematically, you find that in fact the media coverage is kind of predictable. I mean, COVID itself has brought about maybe some slightly different patterns. I mean, I feel like with COVID and when I relate it to H1N1, it just seems like way more coverage. Of course, I mean it's such a bigger scale of magnitude, I guess. But I feel that a lot of these events are actually quite predictable, and it's driven partly by the way the media organizes itself. What our interests and tastes in media are. Even the day of the week the event happens, of course, can shape the kind of coverage. Whether your disaster happens on a Sunday as opposed to a Wednesday, can actually have a certain kind of impact in the way that the media covers your event. But they're just human beings with certain kind of training and working under a certain business model, and so they tend to be driven by the same kind of work patterns and routines. And driven by their editors who are shaped in a certain way too. So the media coverage of these disasters, however rare they seem, if you take a step back and study it in a sort of more disciplined way, you can actually see there's some pretty predictable patterns in the way these things are covered. That's what we found in our analysis of the events that we looked at. I know that right now we're in a period where there's a lot of issue around climate, and I think that we could say that the interest in climate, of course, has changed quite a bit over time. And you now see that elected governments are much more concerned about climate, and they are building into their policies, and it's now becoming more institutionalized. So in that respect, there's every reason to believe that these issues will, these issues are taking hold, and there can be some progress made. I think I would temper it though with Anthony Downs' observations about the issue attention cycle, that a lot of talk doesn't necessarily make its way into action. And when we think about the media coverage, if the politicians are concerned about media coverage to a certain extent, that to a degree drives the risk regulation regime and the behavior modification pieces that they need to implement, which is an important part of climate. There are difficult and unpopular decisions to make, and it seems that a lot of these events, or they get coverage only during the events and the crisis themselves. And that's when we seem to get a lot of attention. So that in itself raises some concerns about, can we bring about more systematic institutionalized change if we're driven by media coverage? It tends to be a little bit flattering, and then when we are actually asked to make difficult choices between disasters and crises, we seem to have a harder time. When you ask people on questions about, are you willing to pay more? Actually, as an aside, I'll just say on some of the tourism stuff, I mean, the tourism sector is a sector that's very concerned about climate, and partly because they don't have a particularly great reputation about the way tourists impact various climates. So the UN is very concerned about sustainability of tourism, and part of it is about being more respectful to the environment. But when you ask people, are you willing to pay more for environmentally friendly tourism, the results are pretty underwhelming in terms of what people are willing to pay. People usually like packaged, cheap, efficient holiday making rather than paying for more expensive, exclusive, uh, sensitive visits to different locations. So I guess I just sort of would say that it kind of raises these questions about whether or not media coverage is going to drive the kind of change that people might like to see in climate. Scenario planning can help us to think about different plausible futures. One of the things I like about scenario planning is that it compels you to think about different futures, however difficult it may be. If you think it's inevitable that the media coverage is going to go up, that scenario planning gives you an opportunity to focus on a future where media coverage isn't all that great. And definitely in the disaster business, there's obviously a lot of spikes during crisis. And I'll say as well, and I'm sure that there are people on this call who are familiar with this, when there is a crisis, the media is interested in a particular kind of story and framing the story in a certain way. And one of the things I often say to journalists who call me during, flooding season, because they will call me during flooding season to make a comment, and I'll say, well, you know, covering the story in the height of the storm when the houses have all been demolished and they're all flooded and kids are crying and their dolls are soaked and this is their dream home and it's been washed away. I mean, that's obviously going to generate a certain kind of sympathy and will lead to probably a certain kind of outcome. But in some respects, we need to have tougher conversations about, should we have been building there in the first place, and are we going to relocate people, and who's going to pay for that? And those are difficult questions, and they're probably not appropriate for the disaster at the moment of the disaster itself. But during the disaster, that is the kind of media coverage you're likely to get. And are people willing to have the tougher conversations between disasters, where maybe it's a little bit more level-headed and a little more rational? Where we start making these difficult decisions about who pays, and making tough policy choices about not building in very popular waterfront property where people like to live. One last point I'll make is, of course, that don't let a good crisis go to waste. And one thing the media coverage does bring to our attention is that when there is a crisis, um, it creates an opportunity for change. And however long the pattern has been of governments being very, very slow on certain issues, certain kinds of crises can bring about some pretty dramatic change. And so the one I just want to bring to your attention, which is from COVID-19, but I've been thinking about it a lot. I used to work for a provincial government years ago, and when I left the provincial government, I had an exit interview with my assistant deputy, who was responsible for administration in our ministry, and he said to me, we're just this far away from a work at home policy. We're almost there. He said, we're a very modern organization. We're going to be a very modern organization. We're going to be a very, interesting place for young people to work. Because I was a young person and I was, leaving, and I think he was trying to convey to me that this can be a very modern organization. So I thought about that conversation. I have thought about that conversation a lot over the last 18 months, because that particular public service, as far as I know, never did develop a work at home policy, some sort of corporate policy that could be implemented. And then COVID hit, and it took about 2 weeks for tens of thousands of public servants to be ordered home to work from home. And, lo and behold, seemed to work just fine. I'm sure there's some complexities about it. We're going to learn about those complexities, but it actually required that crisis to bring about that change. Because a lot of smart people around a table can spend a lot of time thinking about what might go wrong and why we shouldn't do that. So sometimes the organizational inertia and the sort of small c conservatism of the organization and the routine nature of it, and the sort of command and control dynamic as well, can really set in and prevent some changes from coming around. But I always thought it was sort of ironic that it really took only about 2 weeks for this massive work at home policy to happen right across this country in light of this crisis. Now, in a few months' time, I'm expecting a lot of public servants to tour around talking about what a great job they did in getting this huge, massive number of people relocated to home offices. But I'm not sure that's the right lesson. I actually think that what they should be saying is, why could we not address this 20 years ago? Why is it taking us so long? Or I think they should pay equal attention to the fact that this should have been done decades ago, but they were unable to do so. But nevertheless, one of the things we learn from crises is that crises can somehow catapult us forward in very, very qualitative ways, like into a totally different framing of an experience. So in that sense, maybe this climate debate, the mixture of serious institutional response, support from politicians and the public, and the occasional crises can actually catapult us forward. I do think that COVID-19 leaves us with some serious questions about what serious action looks like in a serious crisis. It's hard to imagine that we could think about COVID-19 or think about what crisis response means now. I think that's been often used to frame climate issues, but given how dramatic and serious and resource intensive the response to COVID-19 is, I almost think we have to rethink our use of the word urgent. I think on that I'll just pause and say thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Kevin. This was a great presentation, very timely as we're still going through the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think I'm definitely not the only one who found it interesting, given the amount of questions we have for you. So without further ado, I'm going to get started on the questions. So building up on some of your closing comments about the timeliness for commenting on specific crises as they're happening and unfolding, and the right time to kind of generate change. You've shared with us the issue's attention cycle of kind of how long the media coverage lasts, and kind of how people react over time. What would you say within the cycle is the right time to maybe push some policy change, if we're talking about an extreme weather event that happened or something like that, or to see some change happening, whether it's policy or programs, or in that general cycle that you shared, and how long does that cycle last?
So lots of good questions there. I don't know that I have the answers to them, because I think that I guess it depends on it might depend on the event. I mean, one of the things about exploiting, you have to be careful about exploiting crises, partly because there seems to be, like in media coverage, there seems to be, I remember reading this in the New York Times once, an op-ed writer saying that the newspaper has an ongoing conversation with its readership. And I think that's a nice way to think about it. It's not something that starts new every day, right? If you read the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, Toronto Star, whatever it is, you have an ongoing relationship with them, and you have sort of shared sensibilities, which already kind of says something about your particular bias in the first place before you even pick the news story up, I guess. But there's a kind of tone of what is acceptable, and when you're in the middle of the crisis, um, it would probably seem like bad manners and inappropriate to start to take advantage of that kind of crisis, because of course we're in a business where we're also talking about death and acceptable levels of death and whatnot, that value of statistical life and calculations like that that might seem like very effective tools for those of us who analyze these problems, but they might seem insensitive at the popular level and popular discourse and public discourse, and for those people who don't actually think about these issues the way that we do. And so that what they're seeing is the child who's been washed out of their house and is homeless now, and this was their family home, and they lived there for ages, and now they have no place to go, and they don't have any money, and they don't have any insurance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's the way the story is framed. And I've certainly had conversations with the journalists myself where they've just said this is just not the right time for this story. So what does that mean? So how do you become an entrepreneurial public servant? I think that's, maybe, if I may say, that's one way I would interpret this question. How do you become an entrepreneurial public servant? And I think that there are a couple of things to think about. Um, and maybe I would just point you also to Mark Moore's book on public value. Mark Moore has written lots on public value, and he talks about uh, being a sort of strategic public servant. And I think it's an interesting way to think about it. I think it is maybe a little more conducive to an American model of public administration, but I do think there's some things we can think about in Canadian public administration as well, about how can you be strategic in terms of bringing things forward. So one is, I think that it doesn't always have to be a massive disaster and death. Um, we have to be sensitive to these issues. I mean, we could have a whole really, different kind of conversation about this kind of question about acceptable level of deaths during the pandemic. I mean, a certain amount of this death is inevitable, and how much do you spend to manage the risk down? It's a very hard question to answer. Like anybody has, an answer, and even if we all had an answer, we'd probably all have different answers. It's a really complicated question. But I think that one of the things I've found is there's some things that don't hurt people that can create an opportunity, and that's an audit. So when an audit comes out, an audit will get attention, but no one got hurt in the writing of the, maybe a few people got paper cuts, but really nobody got hurt during the making of that audit. But audits get media attention, and they get the minister's attention. So one thing is to sort of look at an audit coming out and saying, to what extent does this create an opportunity, a headline, a possibility for a headline, or to reinforce some of these points when it's getting some attention. So audits can be good for that. Big meetings, we've got this meeting coming up in Glasgow, so there's an opportunity. There's going to be lots of media attention. So how do you use those? And of course, you don't just wake up the morning they're in Glasgow and think about it. These are things that you need to think about in advance. I remember I knew a director of labor in the public service once who said he used to look at the minister's schedule, and he used to try to familiarize himself with it, so he knew when the minister was making speeches and what those speeches were going to be like, or who he was going to be talking to. He said because he knew that the minister's staff would contact him a week before the event and say, look, he's making a speech next week, or he needs a speech next week. Is there something we can announce? And the director said, I always had my preferred policies ready to go. I think this is a really, really important point for public servants, is that, being prepared is half of the battle. Having an understanding of your policy space, constantly gathering up that information. So when I think about the cybernetics piece of information gathering, standard setting, behavior modification, that research piece is very important. The behavior modification piece is where the timing really has to be right. But the ongoing research capacity is really important. So I think that when the minister's making a speech, et cetera, if you've got your preferred policy positions ready to go, those things can open windows for you to make some progress. So I think being prepared. I think the other thing that is another interesting thing to think about is you constantly have to keep on top of the media coverage of your particular policy area from a number of different sources, whether, Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, New York Times, Guardian, Daily Telegraph, The Economist. Think about think about it this way, it's very, very hard to know what kind of conversations the minister's having on any given day. I mean, our system is kind of, it's kind of top down. It's a little bit close to the minister's office. But one thing you do know is they're very, very sensitive to media coverage. And if your minister is responsible for some particular aspect of climate, then you'll know that his staff or her staff are reviewing that media coverage if there's some sort of headline story or there's media coverage of a particular event, a climate related event. So staying on top of the media coverage to me is about reading the same briefing material as your minister's office. And that's something that's really privileged in a way. I mean, it's a different way to think about it, but really getting an understanding of what your minister is reading and is sensitive to can help you frame your arguments in a way that the minister's office will find it acceptable. So I think those are some things, sort of the kind of non-damaging ways or ways to exploit opportunities that maybe happen between disasters and crises, that can help you move the agenda, and but requires work and commitment on your side to be ready if you're working within the public service, or but also if you're not for profit, in terms of how to get some attention. I mean, there's no question when you're, if you're a strategic not for profit or a public servant, you've got to have your eye on the calendar to see what events are coming up. When is the media going to want coverage? I mean, if you call up a media source, the week before a major event and say, did you know that next Wednesday's, World Climate Day or World Oceans Day or whatever? Do you have anything for that? And because the journalists are usually working on kind of 48-hour, 72-hour outlook. If you tell them, I've got an article for you on this a week from now that you can publish on World Oceans Day, they might say, oh, yeah, that would be great. Actually, can you send me a copy? They're really working at a very, very pressure, time sensitive stuff. They're really only thinking about a few days out all the time. So you can get, or radio interviews, things like that. You can sort of work with their business model and take advantage of it, exploit it, in order to get your message out. But being timely is important. Linking it to events is extremely important. Anyway, just on this last point about, how long does the issue attention cycle last? I don't know how to answer that intelligently, and I feel like this is maybe an area where Down's work probably needs to be updated, right? What is the cycle of an event? COVID, who would have thought, we could be talking about COVID 18 months later. And then there are other issues like, we think about the Facebook issue that came up, which is maybe becoming a bit more of a recurring issue now. But how long does the story about Facebook, last? And then we move on to something else. I certainly think things like, as I say, cyber, really have a hard time keeping people's attention. There's a kind of a general awareness, but the general public doesn't seem to be that interested. I'll pause there lest I ramble on. I don't know if that's a helpful answer or if there's more to be said on that. I'm happy to continue to discuss that, but I'll maybe pause there.
That was really helpful. Thank you very much, Kevin. So Paul also shared a question more specifically around insurance company, which provide financial protection for damage from natural hazards and industrial hazards. How do you think the media how might the media affect public awareness and understanding of the insurance industry? And how might this differ following a natural or industrial event?
Yeah, I'd be maybe more interested to hear what Paul thinks about that. But I think that I almost, yeah, it's I mean, of course, it's a super question, and it's a hard one to answer because my first inclination is, when I think about the media coverage of the insurance industry during the pandemic, for instance, it wasn't super great for them. I think on a lot of fronts around some of the like travel insurance issues and whatnot. I think they got themselves into a little bit of trouble. I think that it seems like this is, from the expert's point of view, better awareness of insurance and how we're going to distribute the risk in a sensible way, where people are paying a better, they're paying for the risk that they're taking, or at least paying more of the risk they're taking. Seems like a very sensible solution to some of our problems. But I would say right now, I feel like it's very hard to get to that place because the media coverage is so overwhelmingly. Or did Paul say around industrial failures? Or he's not talking about natural disasters, around industrial failures?
Both. So,
'Cause
how do you think the media can affect public awareness and understanding of the insurance, and how might this differ following a natural or industrial event?
yeah, it's so hard to I have to say I don't feel particularly optimistic on this point, because I do think that's where expert opinion is, but I don't think media coverage necessarily lends itself to it, which is probably why Paul's asking the question. Because if the media doesn't want to cover the story between events, and during the crisis itself, nobody wants to hear about whether or not you had the insurance or what would the role of the insurance industry was. At least not that I've been aware of. It doesn't seem to be something that gets a lot of attention. So I'm really at a loss to say how they're going to help on the insurance side, given that the nature of the coverage that we've had. Yeah, I'm at a loss. I would be happy to hear Paul's views.
That's okay. Thank you, Kevin. One question that was shared, so you use the term natural disaster quite a bit in your presentation, and this is a term that we often see in the media as well. However, some researchers have advanced that there's no such thing as natural disaster because any disaster by event requires an interaction with humans. Do you think that this term and how it's used in the media can affect the way we perceived our role in influencing some of these events? Do you think the vocabulary around that can create impact kind of our power to act or to be reactive?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting idea. I remember making a presentation on this topic a while ago, just around natural disasters, industrial failures, and this was pointed out to me that you know, it actually makes me think about the tsunami in Japan with the nuclear power plant that failed. That story started as a natural disaster, and the tsunami, of course, wiped out the coast. And the pattern of coverage around that tsunami was very much what we would expect to see. It was high volume, and it was very sympathetic towards the victims, and it was very supportive of government response. But once it started to affect the nuclear power plant, then it actually changed quite dramatically. And then it became a much more ruthless hunt for accountability. And it was a good example, and it became very, very negative, right? And very, very negative coverage about government. And it was an interesting example of how a story isn't so easily categorized. That in this case, of course, it may be slightly different from the question, but in this case, it was something that ostensibly starts as a natural disaster and then becomes an industrial failure. And obviously, natural disasters, the flood coastal areas and whatever, can have these massive cascading effects and have impact industry. So, to what extent would an industrial failure trump natural disaster framing is one thing I would wonder about. Is the media more drawn towards framing something as industrial failure because the accountability piece is clearer in people's mind, and it's easier to hold people to account, and it's easier to have villains, and they would therefore be drawn more to industrial failure framing? Because I guess one of the things I wonder about is, as I mentioned in the presentation, is the fact that industrial failures often neglect the broader organizational context and culture that produced the organizational failure in the first place, and how that's neglected. But yeah, certainly I think if you can tie natural disasters, or perhaps convey the sort of the sense of agency and human interaction, you could perhaps strengthen the calls for accountability. I think that could help.
Thank you, Kevin. One slightly more technical question. You mentioned your initial project looking at H1N1 coverage in different countries, and you mentioned as sorry, choosing one specific newspaper per country.
Yep.
So how are you able to navigate perhaps having the fact that you only had one per country. How did you choose them, and how did you avoid having like an inherent bias in the process? So kind of what was the thinking behind
Sure.
this method?
So the reason why I was drawn to that particular project was because before we did the H1N1 media analysis, we were often comparing, I don't want to say apples to oranges, but different types of apples, right? Because we were looking at bridge failures and train wrecks and chemical failures. And we were saying, well, a bridge failure in, Minnesota is kind of like a train wreck in Quebec, kind of. But it wasn't quite the same. And we knew it wasn't quite the same. And all these disasters always have their own little nuances to make them different. But in some ways, these are sort of qualitatively different. But they seem to fit generally under the category of industrial failure. So what was interesting about H1, and the other thing, of course, too, is these events didn't happen at the same time, right? So you'd have like a bridge collapse in 2007, and you'd have a train wreck in 2011, and you'd say, well, is it different? Are there things that we have to take into account that happened over time, and the event in 2007 have that affect people's thinking into 2011? So it creates kind of some methodological challenges for you when you're doing this kind of media analysis in the first place, when you're trying to put everything under the sort of category of industrial failure. So what was great about H1N1, however imperfect, right? However imperfect, it was actually the same problem at the same moment in time. And that to me was very, very juicy. And you can say, well, was it maybe interpreted differently in different places, and different countries have different healthcare systems, and I think that was all fair game for us to explore and analyze. But at some level, it still allowed us to control a lot of variables, to say this is a very unusual case where we actually have a disease hitting everybody pretty much at the same time. Australia's flu season is, of course, the opposite from our own, so it was a little bit different, which kind of raised some interesting issues there too. But it was kind of the same problem at the same moment in time, so it allowed us to control a lot and say, okay, what does the media coverage look like in these 4 different countries? Now, could I have done it by picking 3 or 4? I mean, the UK in particular is tricky, right? It's a very competitive media market. You've got about 7 or 8 quality broadsheets that really do have much more of an ideological position associated with them, going from the left to the right. So we didn't get into that just because like the rest of the media analysis we've done, it's very, very labor intensive. So we only have so much time and money to spend on doing the media analysis, because we weren't using any software to, do any sort of specific word analysis. It was actually done by individuals reading these articles. So H1N1, I think the New York Times covered it most, which was a surprise to me, because the New York Times typically covers all these disasters a lot less than everybody else. But the New York Times covered it the most. It was about 350, 360 articles. Globe and Mail might have been about 320. Daily Telegraph is 260, and Australian might have been 220, something like that. Those are kind of roundabout, just off the top of my head, kind of numbers. But the point is high volume, right? Like 4 or 5 times higher than what we're used to in these disaster stories. So we had well over like 1,000 articles that we were analyzing. So it was very labor intensive. So how did we pick the articles or pick the newspaper? We picked them with the exception of the New York Times, we picked the broadsheet that is most widely distributed or sold the most in the respective countries, the quality broadsheet. So what we consider to be an opinion leader. I know the Toronto Star outsells the Globe and Mail. We picked the Globe and Mail as sort of a national opinion leader, so it wasn't sort of locked into Toronto or didn't have a sort of Toronto bias. The Daily Telegraph is the most distributed broadsheet, or at least it was at the time. It was the most widely read broadsheet in the UK. It does have a conservative bent to it, no question about it. Did we take it in? Did we control for it in any way? Not really. We just took it as it was. All of the newspapers. The Australian is very sort of centrist, and the New York Times maybe centrist, maybe just a tad to the left as well. But we picked the New York Times because we thought it was an opinion leader. So it was really about trying to pick an opinion leader. I do think it's a bit more of a challenge in the UK because you've got so many quality broadsheets. But anyway, we live with those imperfections, but that's how we came to that particular method and made those choices.
Thank you, Kevin. That was very helpful. Another question, you found that, and before I go to the question, I'd just like to remind everyone, if you do have other questions, please type them in the Q&A box. I have a few more for you, Kevin, but this is a good time to type your questions if you haven't already. So you mentioned that a disaster is in general, generate positive media coverage for governments. Do you know from your research if others like insurance company also get positive coverage following an event? Are most stories about a disaster about government, or is there room to cover other perspectives from what you saw in your research?
No, I'm not aware of the insurance industry or other industries getting particularly good coverage following disasters. And in any event, I would say they get, they're not the center of attention. I can only think of examples where private industry got a lot of negative media coverage. Like I think about Lac Mégantic, for example. I can think of a lot of some examples. The one exception that comes to mind is Walmart, and that is because Walmart is, I mean, they're supply chain management specialists, and they're known for having an excellent capacity, very expert capacity to supply goods and services very, very quickly in a crisis. And so they actually have somebody in Toronto who's responsible for kind of emergency response. That's just in the Canadian Walmart. The U.S. Walmart, it's quite significant. Their emergency response unit within Walmart. So you do hear about organizations like that have actually almost specialized in, or have a subspecialization, I suppose, in emergency response. I've also heard about some complaints from some folks in emergency management that they wish that Canada had a better capacity to coordinate industry. So when there is a crisis, so we think about the Alberta floods, for example, 2013 Alberta floods, when the floods occurred, and you don't have a FEMA, of course, in Canada, there is no federal agency that is responsible for coordination. Some of the private companies that were providing services and support during the crisis really needed to be told what to bring, because if you're going to ship things from Toronto to Calgary, you don't want to show up with a lot of diapers and then find out we don't need diapers. Actually, we needed bottles of water. So there have been calls about, that this is a kind of ongoing debate, I think, in emergency management, is whether or not the federal government should be playing a stronger role in coordination. So, but I have to say, I don't think that industry in these crises usually comes out with positive media coverage, nor can I think of examples of the insurance industry. I think they might get some coverage. I think that you do tend to get a little bit of it with flooding, for example, but I wouldn't describe it as positive so much as neutral and not that much coverage.
Okay, thank you very much, Kevin. So we have two more questions. So there's an expression that is, or used to be, or still is, we'll get your feedback on this, commonly used after a disaster, and it's the expression build back better. Do you find this wording is still of interest to the media and the public? And are you aware if this expression has evolved beyond its initial use in disaster or crisis response?
I certainly see it as a a useful, motivating concept, and it brings, I think, important issues to the fore about the planning process and how we have to integrate decision making more effectively across organizational lines. I think we have to think about those sorts of things seriously in order to achieve a sense of build back better. I have been surprised in my own work when I've talked to different government departments about the role they might play in infrastructure spending and the absence of consultation across government on some of these projects. So if you're going to build back better, it would seem to me, like I know that this was something I thought a lot about when I sort of was the financial crisis of '08, and there was this urgency. I mean, there's a good example of chance favoring the prepared minds and the prepared public servants. I mean, if you had good plans ready to go in 2008, I mean, when there was a financial crisis, suddenly the funding taps were turned on, and the elected government and the senior civil service was very, very interested in moving projects as quickly as possible through the approval process and getting the projects built. And some of the and they're talking about these sort of shovel-ready projects, and they wanted to get the projects going quickly, and they wanted to. There was a sort of sense of urgency about it. So if you had a good project, then you could get funding pretty quickly and make some progress in your particular area. But if you had a bad project, it could also be funded. And this, of course, is some of the criticism of some of the infrastructure spending that did follow the financial collapse of '08, that a lot of the infrastructure money was really spent with the goal of creating jobs immediately and getting cash into the economy. But there wasn't enough effort spent on scrutinizing the projects. And this is partly because the projects, it's kind of too slow. And they wanted to get cash out the door quickly. So I think one question it kind of raises this concept of build back better. If you're going to, approve these infrastructure projects, to what extent are you having integrated planning processes that will facilitate comment from various policy areas that could have some impact? So it's one thing you can say, well, we need greater impact from or input from, climate uh, planners, and that's true. But I think it's also true that in the sort of post 9/11 environment, you needed some comment from those who worked in security to talk about the security of the infrastructure. And in many cases, although climate folks and security folks don't always have the same sort of ideological positions, in many respects, operationally, they're kind of worried about the same issues, which is strong infrastructure, resilient infrastructure, a capacity to adapt, etc. So there's actually a lot that the two can probably learn from each other in terms of how they want to think about planning. But anyway, I was always surprised in the even after the financial crisis was over, there still was an absence of opportunity for various policy areas to comment on the planning. And I do think this raises this other question of, you know, creating some speed to encourage these kinds of projects to happen. When they happen, they're supposed to happen quickly, but you really need to have a good plan in place in your hand. And I would suggest that it could very well be that we're going to see. It's hard to know. You could do some scenario planning around the issue, but I mean, I think in the future we could be looking at we've got some very, very high deficits. Maybe we're going to go into a period of austerity, or maybe we'll be going into an area where there'll be lots of concern around new infrastructure and new green infrastructure, and we need to spend some money in that way. But in any event, I think you need to be prepared. So I think that in order for the government to do that, there has to be better integration of various policy perspectives in order for them to build back better. There's a lot of, I think, nuance and meaning that has to be unpacked by that term, I would say.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And to build on what you were saying, we have someone on the line, I believe, from Public Safety Canada that commented that Public Safety Canada and the government operation centers do provide coordination of federal response to emergencies, but given most accountability for emergency management resides with the province, their efforts are mostly in support of subnational and local efforts. There are often comparisons to the US framework, but the constitutional basis of emergency management is different enough between Canada and the US, and there are difficulties in such comparisons. And that, to support your point, broader cross-country and multi-jurisdictional coordination for Build Back Better activities is absolutely needed in Canada. So I just want to share this feedback as well.
Sure, that's great.
So one last question for you, Kevin, and we'll let you go. This obviously, as you can see, there was a lot of interest in your topic today. So what is your sense of the media interest in climate change looking ahead? Do you believe that attention will keep building, or will the nature of the conversation change over time?
So I would say that I would encourage everyone to use these scenario planning tools. Okay, that's actually that's my topic sentence. Okay, for this answer, because I think that we can work in our own communities and think that that media coverage will continue and there'll continue to be sustained interest, etc. But I do think that the Anthony Downs piece about media coverage going up and down is something for us to be concerned about. I think that the pandemic and the state of healthcare, I think there's so many issues around healthcare that have really been brought into focus that, and giving the aging population and the electoral clout of the boomers, I think there is going to be considerable attention paid to healthcare and long-term care and questions around, perhaps questions about pandemic response. And I mean, I think that's inevitable, but interestingly, even that pandemic response is an issue that hasn't actually gotten as much attention in the Public Health Agency of Canada between crises. It's almost like a natural disaster. It doesn't really get the attention until there's a pandemic, and then there's a, whether it's H1N1 or it's SARS, or COVID-19, suddenly you see this huge, increase in resources at Public Health Agency of Canada and lots of anxiety and operations. But it's very hard to do pandemic planning between pandemics, for a whole bunch of reasons, maybe similar to some of the climate debates. So I think there's going to be immense pressure on health, pandemic response, long-term care, issues like that. I think we've also got these questions of affordability, accountability, or affordability, cost of housing. I mean, this is another interesting dynamic, I think, for the climate debate, is that, certainly in Nova Scotia, it's all the rage to talk about increasing the supply of housing as a way to address the housing crunch. So I can only imagine in more urban, densely urban areas, like what are they going to do to develop to accommodate increased demand in housing without putting, more pressure on the planet, and creating other challenges around climate. I think that's a very interesting issue. So I think there's some other issues that are going to be pulling in different directions from climate concerns. Clearly, there's a lot of attention globally. A lot of politicians are concerned about it, and there's some political momentum. But I don't think it's a given that that'll go beyond the talking phase into the difficult, policy questions and the discussion around trade-offs that really would need to happen. I think that's still, a ways away. And maybe to come back to Paul's earlier question, maybe insurance will have, a bigger impact by not getting media coverage. I mean, media coverage only helps you to a certain extent, if it frames the story in a way that's conducive to good policy outcomes, I suppose. But it might be that by remaining outside of media coverage, lower down, when I talk about those boxes of the kind of busy bureaucrat, maybe it's the busy bureaucrat working away, toiling away in the public service, thinking about how to bring more market mechanisms to bear on some of these climate challenges, that you have more chance of bringing about those changes with less media profile. It's hard for me to see how more media profile is going to result in better insurance policies somehow. I mean, maybe more awareness about buying the policies, I think, but in terms of bringing about change, I almost wonder if this has to be a discussion that might benefit from less media coverage. But I do think if I were a climate person and concerned about climate, I would say that there are some serious competition coming from other areas, health and a huge deficit, and then housing issues that I think are going to be serious competition that are going to prevent some progress in climate. So I don't think the climate issue is by any means a slam dunk that there's going to be meaningful change in this area. Sorry to be bleak. Last note, you should have been a happier, friendlier question for me. That sounds like a very bleak way to end it for those of you who are very concerned about those issues. But I do think that, the Hood Rothstein Rothstein Baldwin framework is helpful because it helps you to think about various contextual pressures that drive change. And when you think about the concerns of the elderly and voting public and the effect of boomers on various policies and whatever, and what are their principal concerns, it kind of leads you to issues around healthcare, I think, and then long-term care. And I think there's going to be a huge amount of pressure there. And I think that will eclipse most things. That's what I would bet. But I would encourage people to do the scenario planning where you actually think about a number of different futures and force yourself to think about different futures and how to respond no matter which future materializes. And how do you, in an entrepreneurial fashion, going back to Mark Moore's thoughts around creating public value, how do you stand at the ready? How do you develop good plans? How do you wait for those audits to come out? Those things that could create opportunities for you to bring about positive change so that you can move the yardsticks in the direction you want to go.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for sharing your thoughts on this. This was much appreciated. And again, as you see, there was a lot of interest, lots of good questions today, signaling an excellent presentation. So thank you very much for this. We appreciate you making the time for doing this on this Friday afternoon. And thanks for everyone that joined us today. Your participation was much appreciated. As always, we'll share Professor Quigley's presentation on our YouTube channel, and you can have it available within the next couple of days if you wish to watch it again. So with that, I'd like to take us to a close, and thanks again, Kevin and everyone on the line for your presence today.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I hope everyone enjoyed it.